Hello, freshly back from watching Project Hail Mary in my Project Hail Mary merch. I might not be the most unbiased source of information on this, but you should go see this movie. It's very good. We should reward good movies when they get made. And man, I took my 9-year-old. He had a great time. I don't know why it's PG-13. I guess it was scary at moments. There's some dead bodies. It felt pretty PG to me. But watching the movie, completely entranced, absolutely emotionally taken on this journey with reflections back to the book reading experience, which for me was several years ago now. So like not so close that I'm really like in the weeds of how they changed things and how that's annoying me, which is great. A couple of moments though, I get brought out of the story by like logistics or like visual things that are like, that's not how that would work, or that's not how this would be done. And I think this is so interesting. And it's interesting in a specific way with an Andy Weir book slash movie, because of course Andy is opening himself up, I think, to a certain extent. I've only talked to him once in my life, but by having the process of science be such an important character in his book, like he's writing the kind of science fiction where the science is our science and it is our world as it exists now. Could we do this with technology that we have now, with a couple of exceptions, of course? And so it's unsurprising that that specific kind of pedantry gets brought out of me and of other people. But I think this is super interesting. Specifically, what is it that brings you out of a story? Obviously, lots of people trying to have that not happen for as many people as possible. So what I did is I asked on my community tab if people have specific quibbles with Project Hail Mary. Now, I will say, this has nothing to do with the book. I might talk a little bit about the book here, but I'm not doing a book versus movie thing. And what I'm going to talk about in this video are many things that wouldn't even appear in a book, because you can't see it. So please know that just by virtue of there being more time to handle it, and also by virtue of the fact that Andy Weir's work has science and the process of science as a main character, you're gonna get way more of that if you read the book, and it's gonna be more accurate and internally consistent, and also consistent with the rules of our universe if you read the book. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the movie. And we're gonna start by the thing that made my wife and I look at each other and roll our eyes a little bit, and also was the most commonly brought up thing everywhere I saw on the internet. He put 2 tubes on the same side of the centrifuge. The centrifuge was unbalanced. Look, this is as silly as it gets for a couple of different reasons. But first I'll explain to you why it's important for the vials to be on the opposite side of the centrifuge. So a centrifuge is a thing that spins things specifically to separate them by density. So more dense things will go lower in the centrifuge and less dense things will go to the top of the tube. I actually downloaded a pirated version of this movie because I wanted to check something. So he's putting the vials in the centrifuge here, and I gotta stop it right when before it starts spinning. I'm concerned that this is entirely a prop, and so doesn't actually have completely opposing sides to the centrifuge, but I think it does. Do I have to count the number of dots on this freaking centrifuge? Okay, I'm going to. 28, 29, 30. Okay, there are an even number. I think that I'm not sure if this is a centrifuge or if it's just a prop, but it does look like you could place them exactly across. So I was worried that they did this because the prop centrifuge had an odd number of holes, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. Centrifuges should be balanced one side to the other. If you have a situation where there's more weight on one side than the other, then the centrifuge will wobble a little bit. That's not good for the equipment, but also it's not good for the separation of your sample because there's a little bit of wobble being introduced, and that's not what you want. You want a direct force downward and only downward. That will do a better job of separating out the various parts of what you are centrifuging by density. Now, I will say, there are some self-balancing centrifuges for which this does not matter, and one would assume that perhaps if you had, the most expensive mission of all time, that you'd just use a self-balancing centrifuge. I don't know, maybe not. This is interestingly both the thing that seems to have taken science people, anybody who's worked in a biology lab, has had it drilled into them that you should always balance your centrifuge. If you only have one thing in there, you should put another thing on the other side that has an equal volume of nothing in it, just so that the centrifuge will be balanced. You are taught this as a freshman, the first time you use a centrifuge. Maybe some people who are like, pipetting HCl by mouth are also not always balancing their centrifuges. It is not insane to me that a somewhat roguey scientist would not balance his centrifuge. And it is not insane to me that maybe they have self-balancing centrifuge on this plane. Plane? Spaceship. But it's interesting to me. It's interesting that this is a thing. In part because this is something that almost any molecular biologist would do by habit. I know I would do it by habit. And I haven't been in a lab in 20 years. But let's hit another interesting few before you're getting into some fun weedsy stuff. As a linguist, I just had to shut my brain off because I wanted to enjoy the fun dialogue between space friends without constantly being like, no, this isn't how any of this would work at all. My fiance asked rightly, where are the freaking flow boxes in this laboratory full of alien microbes? Flow boxes being devices that make it so that you can work on samples without the samples getting access to you, which you would want if you're the only person who can save the Earth and might be killed by an infection by an alien microbe. And none of that. You know, he's just like pipetting that stuff out right in the open air. Just might as well smear it on the inside of his mucous membranes. My partner is an electrical engineer, and when I mentioned that I was interested to know what the science people think, he pointed out that there's some issues with Grace pulling the wiring out and rigging up his lights in the tunnel. Another retired middle school science teacher made this point, so credit goes to her. Why didn't Grace need to file substitute teaching plans before being dragged away from his classroom? Seriously, unless you are dead, you are expected to submit plans. With 200 upvotes, by the way, so this resonates with some teachers out there. All of this together, you've got an electrical engineer being like, you can't just yank rigging out of place. You've got molecular biologists being like, why is the centrifuge unbalanced? You've got teachers being like, why didn't he file his substitute teaching plans? And you've got linguists, and lots of linguists, being like, oh my god, this is really tearing me out of the story. And what this comes down to is that we all have our deep experiences where we do not understand the amount of stuff that we know. And if you were to try and make a movie that satisfied everybody's deep knowledge, you could not make a movie that any normal person would enjoy the rest of the time. Now, I will say, of course, you could balance the centrifuge and people would be like, oh, they balanced the centrifuge. They knew what they were talking about. But throughout the rest of this video, I'm going to show you some much bigger science problems that were pointed out by people that just didn't flash you, like they didn't make the thing happen in your brain. And I'm not sure why, but I think it has a lot more to do with storytelling than it does with what's actually like realistic and not realistic. But really, this is the main takeaway of the video. I know I shouldn't have the main takeaway in the video in the first half of the video, but here it is. People do not understand either how much they know or how much they don't know. Like, the linguistic stuff really didn't bring me out of the story because I don't have much of a background in linguistics. Ripping wires out and having there be sparks in the room, I was much more concerned about the quality of the atmosphere in the space station with sparks going off than I was about how this would actually work with regards to electrical engineering. We have lots of different expertises, and you might say, well, this is a $200 million movie. They should have people with expertise on set. Let me tell you, they did. But also, there's just no way to have all of these people here all of the time. When this centrifuge was set up, like, Ryan Gosling was not in the room for that. Maybe the science consultant was, maybe they weren't. Maybe this was filmed way after. It was like, you know, we have to have this little scene happen. You know, when they write the script, they're not writing down like, and then he places the vials in opposite sides of the centrifuge, you know? They just say, places in the centrifuge, the science consultant reads that and is like, that sounds great, and does not realize maybe that there is this opportunity for a mistake to be made. But more than anything, I want to hit you with like an almost exactly analogous moment from the movie that like you might have like brought you out of the story, but didn't make you question the science credentials of the story, even though physically nothing that different is happening here. And this is from just a tweet I saw. There's a scene in Project Hail Mary where Ryan Gosling's character pukes in an upside-down traffic cone, but they chicken out of playing that bit to its logical conclusion, the other end of the traffic cone. There's holes on both ends of traffic cones. Release the puke cut, Philip Ward. Now you might be saying, Hank, maybe this was a traffic cone that had a sealed off end on one side, but also the centrifuge may have been a self-balancing centrifuge. Most traffic cones have a hole on both sides. Also, my guess is that they don't have little traffic cones like that on the surface of aircraft carriers, which are probably pretty windy places. And I bet somebody who works on an aircraft carrier both knows that there's holes in the end of traffic cones and that they don't have traffic cones on aircraft carriers, but that's not something that brought you out of the story because you've never worked on an aircraft carrier. But more than that, you know that there's holes at both ends of the traffic cone, and I had this thought when I was watching the movie. I was like, haha, is the puke gonna come out of the other end of the traffic cone? But then it didn't, and really it's just a gag. It's a gag because this is a funny thing to puke into. It doesn't make sense that he'd be puking into it, because he should have been puking into the puke bag in the plane. There's probably puke bags in the plane. He probably would have just been puking into that, but it's funnier for him to puke into the traffic cone. And this is like literally physically the same effect as a centrifuge, which is just force pulling down on liquids. And the reason that didn't bring me out of the movie the same way that the centrifuge bit did wasn't any difference in like the suspension of disbelief at the reality of the physical world. It was, this is a science movie and the centrifuge is a science object and you should get the science objects right. But to get deeper into this, we have to discover some things where the science really was wrong in the movie. And in ways that I'm pretty sure, though it's been a long time since I read the book, I'm pretty sure the science wasn't wrong in the book. But I totally understand why the science is wrong in the movie, because they're making a movie. To get to them, let's look at some people's quibbles and see which ones are, I think, legitimate and which ones I don't think are legitimate. If every star, except Tau Ceti, showed signs of dimming, that would mean that every star had a Venus-like planet for astrophage to breed on. This seems like a pretty big stretch to me. Yeah. It is. And I cannot at all remember how this was treated in the book, but it is likely there are plenty of star systems in the Milky Way or within the bubble of the astrophage's reach that would not have a near-in, high-infrared, hot, CO2-rich rocky planet. Now, we don't know that. We're not, like, completely aware of the planetary populations of all of the stars in the Milky Way, but I will say to me this problem is fairly easily solved with we have found one star system that definitely has a near-in CO2-rich planet that doesn't have a dimming star. And just the construction of that sentence being a little bit confusing makes it obvious to me that they wouldn't say that. They would just be like, here are all the stars, every star is dimming except for this one, and saying this star system, we know it has a near-in CO2 rich planet and its star isn't dimming. That's the same thing, but it's just more words and more confusing, so I see why they wouldn't do it. How likely is it for an advanced spacefaring civilization to have no concept of radiation? Even for a species without visible light, radiation seems like a baseline discovery. I agree with this. You might have a sort of like explanatory system that is less based in theory and more based in just sort of empiricism and observation. And then you'd say like, okay, we see that things heat up at a distance, but we don't like fill in the waves between those things, like the infrared radiation between those things. But I think that what Andy Weir is doing here is a really smart and interesting thing, which is saying there are things that we know that seem pretty obvious to us and things that they know that seem pretty obvious to them, like, xenonite. And because of not just the tech tree, where like the way that we discover things in order is going to be different, but also because of like the basis for the tech tree, which is the planet that you start on and the senses that you start with, we're going to have different experiences. It's really hard to say what those differences would be. So I like the idea of introducing some that like they have really advanced material science, but they don't understand radiation. I think that's great. It's really interesting. I don't think it's how it would go, but I think it would go something like that. It's just basically impossible to say how it would go because we don't know the things that we know and we don't know the things that they wouldn't know, basically. So I think, again, this is fine. The pipetting huge drops of black goo to look at them under a microscope made me laugh. That and Ryan Gosling didn't seem to understand how to wear glasses. I love Ryan Gosling wearing glasses. This is amazing. I honestly do like this. I liked the way that Ryan Gosling wore glasses in this movie. It was like a very specific character quirk. But anyway, yeah, it's weird. That's very weird. And the goo in general, everything's very gooey. All the biology stuff is very gooey. And that's just movie stuff, You're just like making it obvious that goo is happening. Like in a usual situation, you'd be dealing with very small amounts of these things and you'd not be able to like scrape goo off of stuff. A central point of tension in the movie is that there's not enough astrophage to get home, yet they arrive at a star that has a large enough concentration of these things to be visible from Earth. Clearly, there must be enough to get home from there. So there were a lot of questions like this, and I think that the answer to them very openly is the lives of the astronauts were not a priority. Anything that slowed down this mission would kill millions of people on Earth. And so the only thing they prioritized was stuff that would be a priority. The lives of 3 people were not a priority in this situation. And so they simply did not do that. I think that Rocky's people might have been in a different situation where their planet had longer. And so like the calculus was different. I don't actually know that. I'm just guessing. But you might think, just grab the astrophage from this area or have a breeder on the ship that would let you create more fuel, which you could absolutely do. It's just all that stuff would be not top priority. And so the only thing that you're doing is top priority stuff because like millions of people are going to die for every week you delay the mission. So just don't build that. We're not building that. It's 3 people's lives. They're going to be heroes. They should go be heroes is the idea. So there's no science reason why you couldn't do it. There's a logistical reason why you wouldn't do it. Why he no breed astrophage to return home? Why continuous energy needed when nothing to resist forward momentum? Speed, fast. The goal is to have this be as quickly as possible. So you continuous momentum whole time, so you get quite close to the speed of light throughout the course of this trip, and you shorten the amount of time that it takes by a lot. That's the reason why. Centrifugal gravity inside of the tunnel is a hot mess. I agree. And in fact, I don't think that the book treated it the same way that the movie did, but I cannot remember. But I will say, I am not about to try and understand this. Like, it is a hot mess. There's a lot of spinning going on in this movie. There's a lot of gravity. There's a lot of forces from a lot of different directions. And I'm like, I'm good. You know, it's not like in that one movie with Sandra Bullock where she's literally being tugged down to earth while they're in orbit. You know, this makes no sense. That was so hard for me because it was so obviously just physics and so obviously important to the story that gravity was working in a way that gravity didn't work. Was the movie called Gravity? That was upsetting to me. But in a situation where there's forces like in every goddamn direction because they're under acceleration, they're spinning, there's a planet, there's drag, there's like everything going on at the same time, don't ask me, man. It would be very hard to know enough to have this take you out of the experience, except be like, no, wait, how would this work? I assume that there are some people for whom they understand why. I feel like this would work. Like if the tunnel, I don't know that the tunnel could connect easily. I don't know that the spinning unit of the two ships would work. If the tunnel's in the middle, there's no gravity. But if the tunnel's not in the middle and it's spinning around with everything else, that's just prescribing a cylinder, right? So you would have gravity in that. But I also think that it would rip itself apart because these two ships are not exactly the same size. And that sounds hard. It just sounds hard. And the first thing I said was, I'm not going to even think about this. And I started thinking about it. And now I don't want to think about it anymore. So I'm not going to. But if you know enough about how spin gravity works for this to take you out of the movie, you are in the top 0.0001% of people who understand spin gravity. So you got to understand. We're not making a movie for you. Why did the collection unit have to be retrieved with an EVA under gravity, and why didn't they not explain this in the movie? So this actually did bring me out of it a little bit in the movie, where I was like, just get out of the freaking atmosphere before you try and collect this thing. So again, my memory of the book is very fuzzy, but I feel like there was a really good reason why, and it did not come out in the movie. And I think that the reason it was not talked about in the movie is simply, you're in the middle of this very tense thing. There's probably a reason. They wouldn't be doing it otherwise. Let's just accept that there's a reason and that they like didn't get into it with us. That's how I felt. I was like, I guess they have to get it while it's still inside of the atmosphere. Why? I don't know. They didn't want it exposed to space because that would kill the microbes? Maybe? I don't know. Why did it take 4 light years to get back, but 11 light years to send the message? Is this talking about relative time? Yes. So it's 4 years for Dr. Grace to get home, 11 years for the people waiting at home because of relativistic effects, which is very weird. Turns out space and time are the same thing. Could Adrian actually have been green skied? Yeah. So obviously you've got a bunch of blue planets in our solar system. These are methane planets. Methane does a good job of absorbing a lot of those wavelengths. So you'd also need something that would absorb a lot of blue, which you could do with a number of different things like sulfur. Like the thing about Adrian is that it's a living planet. So the chemistry is going to be wild. Life is going to mess with everything and make basically anything possible. This doesn't bother me at all. If the light of the star is different, you can also end up with a different colored planet, of course, because that's going to give you the base wavelengths you're working with to scatter and absorb. But yeah, you could definitely have a green skied planet. Why is he Ryan Gosling when as a full adult he should be Ryan Goose? I have always wanted to interview Ryan Gosling and ask him this very question. I've never gotten a chance to. We'll see if it ever happens. Is humanity really one really efficient fuel source away from building an interstellar ship? Yeah, but when we say really efficient, we mean impossibly efficient. The coolest thing, and I remember reading it and being like just over the moon. There's a lot of good parts of Project Hail Mary, but the coolest thing is that the primary villain becomes the savior. Like the fact that this thing is able to absorb so much energy that it can destroy our planet by dimming our sun also means that it can become a fuel source for us to save ourselves. This is so cool. And also that like Rocky's people and humans both figured this out at a similar moment in their, evolution of their species. So cool. So cool. I love that. It's so Andy Weir. It's so unexpected and cool. And like you could see the magic a little bit in the creative process there. I like it a lot. My biggest gripe is that Grace never tried to figure out if Rocky's species was water-based or not. In fact, I believe This is discussed in the book, and Rocky is water-based, as are the Talmiba, as are astrophage, which is great, honestly. Or, like, one of my science gripes is this molecular biologist being like, there's nothing special about hydrogen and oxygen. And first of all, water is not hydrogen and oxygen. Water is water. It is, of course, it is hydrogen and oxygen, but it's a totally different thing from hydrogen and oxygen, because that's how chemistry works. And there just is there is a lot of actually special stuff about water. Water is very special. It is great that we have this scientist who's like, water is not necessary for life. And then it turns out that all of the very weird, very different life in the book is actually water-based. That gets discussed quite a bit in the book, I think. And it is a little weird that we don't talk about, because maybe Rocky isn't. You don't ever find that out in the movie. And that would be a moment of vindication for Grace. But in fact, I think that Rocky is water-based, just in a weird way. But also totally different chemistry. This is also talked about in the book. I remember, instead of being based on oxidation, it's a reduction-based life, which is very cool. So completely incompatible systems of life, but both requiring the universal solvent. The stretchy xenonite panel of Rocky's tunnel ball perplexed me, although I didn't catch if they addressed it. The iridian atmosphere pressure in the movie, Rocky's environment has substantially higher pressure, shouldn't be bulging into the Hail Mary side. I assumed that this was not just responsive to touch, that it was in some way intelligent. So it could stay a certain size or it could move, which we a little bit saw with Grace's spacesuit, and then at the very end of the movie with Rocky's reverse spacesuit. I think that it's an intelligent material, and so it can be flat or it can move. And then this is probably, interestingly to me, the most obvious. I wouldn't call it a mistake, because I think everybody knew that they were doing it. And so if you don't want to be taken out of the movie, just don't watch this part. But when Rocky breaks the xenonite barrier to rescue Grace, if that had happened, the atmospheric pressure, the heat, the ammonia would have killed Ryland Grace. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why they didn't do it that way in the book. But you gotta make a movie. This is what's so interesting to me, that the centrifuge, which might just be a self-balancing centrifuge, brought so many more people out of the story than knowing that 200-degree ammonia high-pressure gas was flooding the cockpit of this spaceship, and somehow Ryland Grace's lungs survived. And I think that part of that is that this was a moment in the movie where so much was happening that you're really pulled along in the story. So all you're thinking about is these two people and whether they will survive. But I think there's also a structural thing here, where there's just something about an unbalanced centrifuge that's going to be a red flag to so many people that it's going to pull you right out. This is so silly. Obviously the physics are a much bigger deal in a moment where you might have somebody breathing a pure high pressure ammonia atmosphere, which is going to kill you. I'm not upset at all by Rocky being able to break the xenonite, because Rocky seems to be able to do all kinds of things with xenonite. So that seems like he could totally do it. But yeah, Rocky would actually have to use the airlock if Rocky was going to actually save Grace. But that didn't bring me out of the story. It didn't bring me out of the story at all. And I think that that's fascinating. This person and a lot of people thumbs upping. I don't have any questions, but please make a video, at least just talking about it, because the movie was amazing. It is really good. One of the things I've been seeing about it is that it feels hopeful. It feels like humans being able to solve problems together. And in that very beginning part of the movie where he's talking to his classroom, and the kids, it's like, maybe you should talk to your parents about this stuff. He gets into it instead, and all the kids think they've heard the bad news. And his response is, yeah, but right now, the greatest problem solvers that have ever existed with the greatest tools that have ever existed are working on it. And to me, as compared with a Don't Look Up kind of movie, it's the exact opposite, though not entirely. There's something dystopian about the way the problem is being solved, about the amount of power that's been placed into a few people's hands to make absolutely disgusting and ruthless decisions. And so part of me doesn't want to apply hope core to a system of problem solving that is based largely on science, but also on, a little bit of international despotism, the creation. But I don't know if there's something collaborative about it. It's not gotten into that much in the movie. It's more discussed in the book, again, which I have not read in years. But there is something to that, and there's something to its popularity. Oppenheimer was the other really big opener of the last decade, and that's very much a movie about humans and about human power, but it is about the devastating consequences and the horrors of human power. And then you got horror, like actual horror, which also, like Sinners, which I haven't seen and I'm really looking forward to seeing it. In general, the horror genre, I don't know that this is true for Sinners, but in general, the horror genre is not like, doesn't tend to be particularly hopeful, though it can be. And I've seen some people complain about the fact that it's fun in a way that the book wasn't. Like, the book was more that Andy Weir experience where you're like in it solving the problem, and what's pulling you through is the process of problem solving, which is so cool, because if anybody's ever worked in an engineering environment, you know what that's like. You know, when you start out with a seemingly insolvable problem, and then throughout the course of time it becomes second nature to solve it. And like, you see that in the movie. It's expressed visually in the movie more than it's pulled out of you in the actual like process of problem solving, though there are good moments of that as well, like in the beginning with the Venus experiment. That actually really good. Got goosebumps just thinking about it. Now I'm just talking. And look, here's a great one to end on. My question is, why were my eyes watering the whole 2.5 hours? A movie has never done that to me before. I'm like definitely a movie crier. They get me. The previews can get me. But I looked over at my hard as nails wife, and she was crying at some moments as well. And I'm sorry, Catherine, for calling you hard as nails. She doesn't cry in movies that often. She's not hard as nails. She's a very loving person. Catherine and I both love stories like this, where there's a lot of like little sillinesses, and it's funny and it's cute. And then it turns, and you see the love, you see the appreciation, you see how much people matter to each other. And this isn't just like, we're going to save the galaxy. It really is, we're going to save each other. And those are the parts that hit hard and make you realize, like, what is it that makes us care about something? And it's so interesting that, like, you know, we care about this little centrifuge mistake, but in comparison to watching someone sacrifice themselves and maybe as much for this one other entity that they care about as much as for their entire planet. It just is human. And I know that I'm not talking about a human character right now, but it just is human. And I like the idea that if we were to ever encounter something like us that happened in a totally different way and knew totally different things, it would also have elements of that. And I don't know. I don't know if it would, but I like to think that it would.